Hey, welcome to the Christ Revealed YouTube channel. I got a great interview coming up for you. Really great to be here with you. Enjoy this interview. And when you look at the history, to match that evidence, because some of the detractors would say, well, because you were using the term of first century, that the Gospels, as far as dating them.
Yeah.
Some people think they came much later.
Yeah.
So, when you really look at the balance of what the scholars have found in the data and research relative to dating the Gospels,
right.
What is the conclusion that you've drawn based on what you've seen?
Yeah, this is a good question because times have changed, and in the last 50 years, there's been a significant shift in the opinions of scholars. Mm-hmm. And the tendency in the past was to late date the Gospels, mm-hmm. put them, early first century to late second century, and way after these events took place, mm-hmm. long after the witnesses could have testified to anybody copying the information. And this, of course, impugns the credibility of the accounts themselves, mm-hmm. if this is the case. But I have asked scholar after scholar, why do you late date the Gospels? What are the reasons for it? Now, I'm prepared to give a number of arguments for an early date. Mm-hmm. These are strong arguments. One of them, for example, is that one of the most important events in the first century regarding spiritual things and Christians and Jews and everything was the destruction of the temple and all of Jerusalem in 70 AD by Titus of Rome. Mm-hmm. This is huge. None of the writers mention it. How could nobody mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem, mm-hmm. especially if they're trying to make a case for Christianity, and this would be a great dig back at the Jews. See what happened? God destroyed Jerusalem because you rejected the Messiah that we just invented, right? In the late Gospels. Nobody mentions it. Here's a good reason they didn't mention it. It hadn't happened yet. Okay, this is one line of argumentation for earlier dates for the Gospels, but there's a whole bunch of others that are very good. But every time I ask about why you late date, I get the same answer, because you have what theologians call a high Christology in the Gospels. And a high Christology means Jesus wasn't just an itinerant preacher, right, who said some nice things and happened to get himself killed. Who knows why anybody would kill a guy like that, but that's all he was. Later on, everybody started developing him into the supernatural Son of God, only way of salvation, miracle worker, risen from the dead. That's mythology. Mm-hmm. And mythology takes time to develop. And so the Gospels must have been written much later because it takes time for that kind of mythology to develop. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that sounds like cheating a little bit. You're kind of assuming that Jesus wasn't this person. For what reason? Mm-hmm. You're assuming that there was no miracles. You're assuming there is no Son of God. You're assuming that. And the fact that it shows up that way in the accounts must be proof that they were mythological things developing over time.
So it's a confirmation bias.
Exactly right. Yeah. It's exactly right. Yeah. Now, one trouble with that way of looking at it is not only the circular reasoning, but Paul's writings, there's not a lot of contention about the basic writings of Paul. Mm-hmm. He was a huge player in the first century, and everybody knew it. And certain things like Galatians and Romans and Corinthians, and these are major contributions of Paul to the literature of that day, and it's not contested as being written by Paul, all right? And we know these things are like in the 50s, right? Paul was executed around 63. That's the end of his life. So he's writing in the 50s. Okay, Jesus died in 33. So within 20 years, we have Paul writing in Romans saying that he was declared with power to be the Son of God according to the resurrection. Mm-hmm. That's the third verse of the book of Romans. He launches the book of Romans with this statement. That is high Christology in the 50s. Wow. So we have good reason to believe this didn't develop through mythology. This was the earliest testimony that the people who are defending Christianity gave about Jesus of Nazareth. So all that to say, we have good reason to believe the historical reliability of these texts. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of detail in them. There's a lot of things that are embarrassing mm-hmm. to the people who are recording these and writing them down. The disciples, they didn't look good. They looked pretty stupid, pretty dumb. unethical at many points. Let's call down fire from heaven on them and destroy them. This is James and John, the beloved disciple, sons of thunder. Jesus said, no. Women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Why is that significant? Because they didn't have women's lib back then.
Right.
They didn't trust women. So if you're gonna write a story that you want people to believe, but it's false, make women the first testifiers to the risen Christ. That's dumb. Okay.
So it's interesting because I guess there's two things here. One is say archaeological evidence that would corroborate, but
that's another stage of corroboration.
And I want to ask you about that in a second.
Yeah.
But the second is the fact that if somebody has an agenda that to get an outcome that is separate from what's true.
Yes.
That's not the way to get it.
That's not the way to get it. Right.
Yeah. So they weren't being cunning. They were being reporters.
Well, see, this is the conclusion when you look at the details, because you'd think if the writers were being cunning, there are certain things that show up in the account that you wouldn't show up there.
Right.
Okay, and there are lots of other things that also show up that are odd. For example, Jesus is struck in one of the accounts, and the soldiers strike Jesus, and then they say, "Who struck you?" And if you're a reader of that account, you're thinking, "You struck me. I just saw you hit me." Why is that in there? Well, you don't know until you read one of the parallel accounts where it identifies that Jesus was blindfolded by these soldiers. Now, these are two separate accounts. And the second account makes sense of something that seems unusual in the first account.
Right.
These are odd ways that you see these accounts kind of supporting each other, and then you see, well, this wasn't fabricated. Okay, this is an argument against the fabrication thesis, and there's lots of things like that too. So they weren't cunning, and this gives you reason to believe the accounts. Now, one objection that could be raised is, oh, well, you're saying that these scholars have a bias, and that's why they put it. Well, the Christians had a bias too. They believed in Jesus, and so they were trying to put forth an account that made Jesus look good and Christianity look good, so they had a bias. Now, and to this I say that there are, okay, I understand the point you're making, and I guess the Christian did have a bias if what you mean is a point of view. But there's two types of biases. There's a bias that is a bias to distort.
Right.
And then there is a bias in which you have a point of view in which there's no evidence of distortion. Okay? I imagine that Kobe Bryant's mom thinks he's a pretty good basketball player.
Right.
And you could say, well, she's biased, but she also happens to be right.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
She has a point of view, but that doesn't mean she's false in her assessment.
Right.
Okay? Now, in the case of the scholars now, we can see it's pretty obvious that they are late dating because they are committed to a point of view regarding Jesus before they view the evidence. Okay, that sounds suspiciously like a bias to distort. Okay, what about the early Christians? What about the people who gave the message first? I saw Jesus, and they proclaimed this kind of message. Did they have a bias to distort? Were they lying? Well, the rule about lying is this: if you want to tell a lie, you tell a lie that benefits you, not a lie that gets you beaten, stoned, whipped,
Right.
and crucified upside down.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
This is not smart.
Right.
All right? So this is what happened to these guys. If anybody knew that the story was false, it was these apostles who testified to having seen the risen Christ. But these guys, in many cases, went to their death with this testimony on their lips, and certainly all the rest of them had the sentence of death hanging over them for making such a testimony. And Saul of Tarsus is an example of the executioner. He was the one who was going around collecting these guys and putting them to death, hauling women and men off to prison and overseeing their executions. So this was serious business for these guys. Where is the evidence of bias to distort in the case of the disciples who wrote the Gospels? There's no evidence. And if there's no evidence, then we have no reason to impugn their character on this account.
That's it for this particular interview. Thanks for joining me. Really excited to take this ongoing journey with you as we keep bringing more content. If you haven't already, you really should subscribe to this channel. There's a lot of phenomenal content coming down the road into the future that you'll want to know about. Leave a comment down here. I think people would love to hear from you, and then you can hear from them too. If you liked it, go ahead and give a like. It only takes half a second, and share this with people that you care about. The world needs more light in it right now. So thanks for being with me. Hope to connect with you again soon.